Don't you want devoted followers who leave their families for you, give their money to you, give their bodies to you, give up their lives for you, consider you God, and will kill for you? Don't you want to become a cult leader?
Salutations, my children, and welcome to my latest video sermon. I hope my transmission finds you well. Now, let us begin. What you heard in that intro segment was the opening to the 1999 short film Mind Control Made Easy, or How to Become a Cult Leader. A horrifying satire structured like an informational VHS tape that explains how cults and other destructive power structures target, manipulate, and ensnare people into doing whatever they want. What's so disquieting about it is not just its brilliant use of unsettling yet funny moments mixed with the deeply disturbing story it tells, but that it isn't far off from the real phenomenon. It feels as though there's been a rising interest in the stories surrounding real-life cults in recent years. It's not hard to understand its popularity, though. It's intriguing, particularly for Americans like myself. A lot of our culture and tradition is still deeply religious in nature. Our lives are regularly impacted by the concept itself, and it's often considered a very personal, important experience for many. The idea that becoming a source of manipulation, harm, and even death is extremely evocative, and we've seen too many public examples of it to rest easy. And with expert Steve Eichelt's estimation of 10,000 cults existing in the United States, it's not exactly hard to find people that have first-hand horror stories of them. So why don't we discuss them directly through the films they themselves have made, and what they tell us, and what they don't. But what is a cult exactly? Unfortunately, there isn't really an agreed-upon unanimous definition. So let's get a baseline. Let's pull the old YouTuber trick of asking Merriam-Webster, cause I'm not above that hack shit. A quasi-religious group often living in a colony with a charismatic leader who indoctrinates members with unorthodox or extremist views, practices, or beliefs. You can probably already see the problem with a definition like this. What defines an unorthodox or extremist view? Doesn't that simply mean it doesn't conform to popular culture's ideas? Is a cult whose beliefs become mainstream no longer a cult? What if it becomes accepted as a part of society? And what does it mean to be quasi-religious? If the beliefs are held truly by the leader and their followers, how is that not religious in nature? How is religion even defined? Can something that declares to not be religious still be so? Or is it just self-deterministic? Not to mention, many groups consider cults have survived past the death of its charismatic leader, so does it cease to be a cult then? And if you stretch a bit, this definition could apply to many popular religions. I mean, if I want to get extreme, it could be argued that the Catholic Church centers around a leader considered closest to God, with a tight-lipped power structure that has resulted in the covering up of many abuses. Is the Catholic Church then a cult? You get my point, and it's one a lot of cults rest on. These structures exist within many real-life systems in the world we consider completely normal, and it's hard to determine what actually the difference is between a traditional religion and a cult. So, to be clear, I am not commenting on any legal status of these organizations I discussed today. When I refer to these groups as cults, I'm not saying anything about my own opinion on them, but rather referring to people colloquially calling these groups that in some manner. I am not making any moral, legal, or otherwise claims beyond that. Okay? Please don't contact me. So what are my rules for this project? The obvious first rule is that all these groups have to have been colloquially referred to as a cult in some manner. As stated, there isn't really an exact definition without any disclaimers, so I'm going to instead go by the rule of reputation to guide me along here. Second, the work has to be considered in some way a feature film. We're not going to be counting informational VHS tapes or YouTube videos. These projects have to be in some way considered a traditional feature film. Third, I want the cult in question to be somewhat involved in the production. This can vary from project to project, but I want some of the materials involved to have some consultation from the group involved. They need to earn the made by portion. And finally, the film has to deal in some way with the teachings of the cult. I want it to be an insight into the group itself. Now today we're just going to be focusing on films, 5 in particular to be exact. If you're interested in a wider overview of all types of entertainment made by cults, Paper Will has their own video that I'll link in the card. It touches on not just some of the films we'll be expanding upon today. Yeah, I hadn't seen or heard of the video before starting this project, so there's some overlap. It's all completely coincidental. I promise I was not trying to copy him. But also music and VHS tapes and YouTube videos and all kinds of art. So check it out if you want more of that. But here we're going to focus on analyzing these 5 films bit by bit and then telling the stories of the groups that made them. To start, let's begin with something a bit more on the lighter side before we truly delve into the horrors this subject can contain. Something to ease us all in, something innocent, something truly... let's go with eccentric. The Unarius Academy of Science is definitely the most innocent looking group I'll be covering today. Truth be told, you can argue that they don't actually fit into the definition of cult. And as far as I know, there have been no allegations of anything nefarious with relation to this group, nor any abuses of power. In a way, we can think of this as the more harmless idea that comes to mind when we think of that word, and as such, a decent entry point for this idea. Founded in 1954 by Ruth and Ernest Norman, Unarius stands for Universal Articulate Interdimensional Understandings of Science. Ernest Norman and Ruth Norman were self-described as clairvoyant, and were able to, as a result, better discover the interdimensional understanding of energy, karma, and past lives. The idea being that you could truly understand the self through understanding your past lives and spiritually heal yourself through that connection, and through recognizing the connective spiritual energy of humans. Oh, and also extraterrestrial beings, which they call Space Brothers. Yeah, so in 1973, Ruth, who at this point had adopted the spiritual consciousness of Uriel, the prince ruler of our realm, please go with it, apparently made mental contact with extraterrestrials, helping realize the historical past of each realm and help lead the planets to an eventual interplanetary confederation. I think at least. The website is... overwhelming to say the least. Very Web 1.0. Makes me want to visit Homestar Runner. Admittedly though, as I said, the group doesn't seem to be much in the way of the typical high control definition of a cult many may associate with the term. They may have 2 central figures, but both passed on and the Academy survived. They don't encourage dissociation or isolation. In fact, they discourage proselytizing altogether. They don't view joining Unarius as a decision that must be undertaken to fulfill the self, but rather just a way of healing. They even discourage members from seeing themselves as above others, saying that them and non-believers have the same inherent human value. One just had their paths lead to Unarius. And that's kind of refreshing for a religion in a way. Honestly, I did debate if they even counted for a list like this. But they just had been put into the UFO cult category in too many discussions that I felt like they indeed fit the guideline of being socially referred to as a cult. Besides, I had to cover this in some manner. If only because of all the movies I'm going to talk about today, this is the one I've been familiar with for the longest. And that's because I own it on Blu-ray. See, almost 5 years ago, back when I was 19, a friend of mine told me about this movie, sort of as a unique oddity, a passionate spectacle of brilliant early special effects made by a strange, artsy cult in their words, that was worth it for the experience. So I did what most normal people would do. I went to their website and ordered it on Blu-ray for $15. Now, some of you may say that it was incredibly irresponsible of me to give my money to this group just because I thought it would be really funny. And to that I say,
I am Zan, and have always been Zan.
Yet you have lived in other times and other bodies.
How can this be so?
It was really funny. The film takes place in 160,000 BC, and is apparently a true story, which Sure, I'll take your word for it. We see a caveman living a simple life, wondering what the stars mean, and if there's more beyond them out there, when suddenly he is visited by a flying saucer, who beam down and give him unique consciousness to understand them, so they can provide him with their knowledge. And this is where we come to the best part of this film. See, Unarius refers to this style of film as a psychodrama. The idea being that the actors are channeling past lives in order to tell a real story. Hence the based on a true story label. And let me tell you, if there's anything that makes me doubt all of Unarius' claims, it's the fact that they're just not very good at channeling those past lives.
I do not understand that which is happening. You are so bright.
Oh my god! Oh, that's just amazing. That's just amazing. At first, the caveman doubts his need for past lives and finds himself fearing the visitors, only for them to show him a vision of his past life on a different world, where he was presented with the option of embracing violence and war for a growth in power in the current day.
I've come to give you a great opportunity, one that you won't want to pass up. You'll have even more power than you've got now.
Or embracing a message from Uriel, showing him the beauty of the manner of love and karma, and the knowledge of interdimensional understanding to improve society and reap the rewards in future lives. And is that a Stargate sequence? Anyway, despite being shown the light, he ends up siding with the immediate gain of joining the Empire, who promise him power beyond his wildest dreams. With his first mission, he is tasked with destroying a rival planet. A planet that, instead of engaging in direct combat, merely wishes to stall long enough to tell him of their own revelation. That Uriel reached out to them as well, and they accepted. In fear that he chose wrong, he presses the button, eliminating them in a total planetary genocide before realizing to his horror what he has just done, and how it's destroyed him inside. He manages to go on many further space missions, gaining more and more power, before eventually losing it all when daring to fight on land for the first time, being destroyed by his own hubris.
But you killed yourself back there on that ship with those 4 billion people.
It is then revealed that the being speaking to him is actually the leader from before, who tried to convince him to turn to the light of Uriel before being destroyed, now an enlightened being. And they offer the caveman yet another chance to embrace the light he once rejected. This time, he accepts. In a feat of admittedly stunning special effects for a project like this, we see his journey to enlightenment. There's an almost enigmatic element to watching this film. An element of guffaw and laughter at the unorthodox and in some way absurd beliefs that are delivered with the same confusing prose as the old pathologic script.
Go, Onion! I need to collect the tools.
The terrible acting presented as a general recalling, the costumes that look like throwaways from a cheap Sentai show from the 70s, and the most obvious bald caps and fake facial hair you've ever seen. But there is something impressive about this film that I won't say about pretty much any other film presented here. There is an honest-to-God passion on display. Not only are the special effects really good, but the sets are surprisingly high quality for the production value, and even some of the shots are at times incredibly dynamic and work well to demonstrate the emotional state of these characters. Like, this shot of his ultimate downfall is shockingly evocative, with the framing emphasizing his place in the front, highlighted by orange light directly on his face, and the vision of the shot into the space he thrived in from far away, and the destruction he enacted on the ground. Not to mention that the story is complex but grounded enough in its themes that it's kind of fun to see it come to its conclusion, even if occasionally it gets dry. In fact, I kind of found myself getting sucked into this weird, cheap little thing. You can see why many nowadays view it more as outsider art in the vein of artists like the Shags.
My gal's name is Foot for your always likes to romp.
Who were also mocked at first, but then found a cult following that appreciated them for their eccentricities. Hell, I've seen many draw comparisons of this film to the works of many in the avant-garde scene of the era, particularly Alejandro Jodorowsky's film The Holy Mountain. And with the passion they tell their story in its set design and special effects, it's hard not to buy in just a little bit on that level. To buy into its world for the very little time you have with it. There is a difference though. Jodorowsky was always spiritual, but his films were never meant to be literal preach work, but more abstract representations of the world at large, using said philosophy and spirituality to connect the human spirit. Jodorowsky doesn't have a class on how you too can receive the enlightenment of the alchemist, nor does he claim the events of his film were literal or real. And that kind of becomes the conflict in discussing this as a film. Is this a recruiting tool made by the organization to grow itself? Just a piece of propaganda? Or is it art that just happens to be produced from the mind of the person who believes in Unarius' teachings? In a way, it blends both. It's clearly made with passion and occasionally does produce some intriguingly good filmmaking, but it's also sloppy and cheesy and sometimes kitschy, and you have to wonder how much of those failings come from the fact it's not a typical film, it's from an organization with a direct belief system that they are trying to spread. There is no hidden metaphor. This is all literal. And beyond that, Unarius does not exist within a bubble. Because yes, this may all just be innocent fun, but not every group is as innocent. We need to be cautious when observing groups like this. And we found that out when a different San Diego area group with a similar affection for UFOs took an unfortunate turn.
Now, Eyewitness News.
San Diego Sheriff's deputies stumble into a house of death, a multi-million-dollar mansion filled with dozens of bodies, the site of a grim mass suicide.
Good evening. I'm Bill Butel.
And I'm Diana Williams.
We are just learning the scope of the tragedy in San Diego, and this is the latest. Police tell reporters 39 people are dead, all males between the ages of 18 and 24.
On March 21st, 1997, members of a different UFO religion in Southern California called Heaven's Gate walked into a Marie Callender's in San Diego, ordered the same food one by one, dressed the exact same way in a jogging suit with the same Nike shoes, before they all returned to their compound for the night. Over the next few days, they would all castrate themselves before committing suicide, coinciding with the passing of the Hale-Bopp comet, which they believed would take them to the afterlife. All in all, 39 people died, with many to this day still horrified by the ease with which this cult had convinced them to take their own lives. I specified Unarius' more benevolent appearing behavior as an outlier partially because of this specific tragedy. Both existing in the San Diego area and both being commonly considered UFO cults, Unarius drew a lot of comparisons after the tragedy. Luckily, there have been no incidents of the sort.
People have tried to say that if we believe in extraterrestrials, then we're like them. That's like saying all people who believe in God are the same. We have nothing in common with those people. They were trying to escape problems of life. Our space brothers have taught us we must learn to work out our problems.
But the shadow of Heaven's Gate looms large over the UFO spiritualist movement. The fact that we can debate Unarius as outsider artists comes with the fact that everything they have done has seemingly been handled responsibly. But just a 30-minute drive away, we saw what happens in a group when that is not the case. When a spiritualist UFO group turns to obsessing with doomsday, leading to a tragedy that shook the entire nation. And unfortunately, while Unarius may be a seemingly benign example to begin off this video, and from all accounts seems to be totally fine and healthy, not every group is. Heaven's Gate is proof of that, and they aren't alone either. Let's talk about anime. It's one of the most popular forms of entertainment in all of the world. A term ascribed to Japanese animation, it's hard to find someone my age who doesn't engage in the medium at least a little bit. Hell, I'm included in that. I'm not deep into the scene, but my two favorite shows of all time are both anime. Neon Genesis Evangelion and Puella Magi Madoka Magica. But with a medium commanding that large an audience both within Japan and around the world, it was inevitable for one of these groups to take a shot at using it to share their message. Now, there have been multiple cults that have used anime to spread their message, with Happy Science being an example. Check out Mother's Basement's video on the subject in the card. But we're going to focus on another group, because Happy Science were far from the most dangerous group to work in this medium. Meet Shinrikyo. Born partially blind in 1955, Juzo Matsumoto was born to a poor family with the dream of becoming rich one day. First that came in him starting a health tonic clinic, but he was arrested for doing so in 1982, leading him to start all over. 3 years later, he announced publicly that he had learned to levitate. That gained him enough supporters for him to open his own yoga school in 1987, named Shinrikyo. As a group, Shinrikyo incorporated various elements of Taoism, Christianity, Vajrayana, and astrology that interested Matsumoto, who had since rechristened himself as Shoko Asahara. His claims of levitation and other supernatural abilities centered him as a man who had found the secrets to the universe no one else had, with him even claiming he learned secrets directly from the Dalai Lama himself. Within a few years, the group would grow massively and even attempt to break into politics in 1990, which failed, angering Asahara. Regardless, their reach still increased, and by 1992, he released his infamous book, Declaring Myself the Christ. But we are here to investigate what he and his group released a year earlier. A 10-part anime OVA totaling about an hour in length known as Chouetsu Sekai, or Transcendental World. The first thing you'll notice about the Transcendental World is that it's cheap. Anime is known for its cost-cutting measures, including mass instances of overwork and underpay that often lead to the animation suffering in favor of the big set pieces. But even at its worst, I've never seen any animation look as cut to its bone as it consistently is here. Not to mention, one of the most essential parts of any anime is its opening. They got Evangelion's Cruel Angel's Thesis, Lane's Duvet, Cowboy Bebop's Tank, Death Note's The World, which makes it a shame that the sound quality of this entire film is awful. And that's especially notable in its opening, which sounds like it's been recorded by a man on a cheap laptop mic desperately trying to not wake up his roommate. Could be worse. Could be the 4Kids version. Here's how the story goes. They find out about a man who can levitate, there's no doubt. After its 2-minute long opening, we get to part 1, which chronicles Asahara's discovery of his ability to levitate. One day, while in a meditation group, he felt something different while meditating, but decided to press on.
瞬間的に尾てい骨から頭頂に向かって神秘のエネルギーが吹き上がったかと思うやいなや、ゴムまりのように体が跳ね出した。そして最後に飛び上がった時、私はなんと空中にとどまっていたのだ。
Yes, he bounced his way to levitation. I need to remind you, this is how he portrays it directly. I am not making any of this up. He tells us how levitation helped him click into place many spiritual truths, but that doing so without a guru, he found himself alone on his journey, yet satisfied as he had pulled off one of the 6 miracles, which leads us to part 2.
超越世界第1回不要いかがでしたか?
No, actually, we are immediately asked what we thought of part 1 and our opinions. It's been 7 minutes, and 2 of those were the intro, and the other 2 were this repeating screen again. I don't know anything yet. Can you just wait a bit? The voice also informs us that Asahara is one of the very few to experience nirvana with no guru, making him one of the few considered to achieve supreme truth all on his own, and how he plans to lead the members of the group to said state as well, spreading it as far as possible through his teachings. In part 2, we see a time when Asahara was able to astral project into a room of many of his students, only to overhear a rumor that 2 of his students were pursuing a love affair. Romantic and sexual relations are strictly forbidden in the group, and as a result, Asahara calls one of the students involved and tells her to stop pursuing the other student. with the idea being the amazing nature of which he was able to find out such a secret. It's in the next outro segment that we learn the 10 rules of their religion.
不殺生、生き物を殺してはならない。不忠盗、盗んではならない。不邪淫、邪淫をしてはならない。不妄語、嘘をついてはならない。不記語、意味のない言葉を話してはならない。不悪行、悪口を言ってはならない。不良舌、人と人とを仲違いさせるようなことを言ってはならない。不愛弱、貪ってはならない。不邪悪心、相手を害してはならない。不名門、無知によって真理を否定してはならない。
And if they do not follow these rules, they will be doomed in reincarnation. Part 3 concerns the idea of incarnation, or a different body you have outside your physical one while meditating. This body can sink, teleport, fly, walk through walls, morph, and even be seen by others, as shown by a few of the cult members noticing the guru's incarnation on the street and thinking it's really him, only for it to be revealed later to them that his body had never left the compound. It's kind of unclear though if everyone else saw him flying through walls and stuff before, or if it's just when he decides to be seen. The lack of clarity about his powers is going to become a normal thing, so let's just move on. Part 4 is about a time in which Asahara was projected a vision of Tibetan Lama Kala Rinpoche, who he searches out. There isn't much else to the chapter besides them meeting each other in a vision and then them meeting in person, both having anticipated the other, while Part 5 deals with Asahara receiving a final farewell projection from Kala Rinpoche as he passes on, followed by him and his pupils grieving him at his temple in India. Part 6 starts out telling of ninjas? Where they explain that ninjas could not actually disappear like they are portrayed as doing in the movies.
Was that a ninja?
More like a nanja. Terrible what passes for a ninja these days.
But that is possible through the Buddhist meditation of Shinrikyo.
よく見ていてごらん。今、姿を消してしまうから。
As he reappears, he explained that an energy field surrounding him allows him to do this. And then everybody clapped. We do not know how this energy field works or how he conjures it. He just says that and we move on. Once again, I kind of have more questions. And once again, they're not going to be answered. Part 7 concerns how one can cure ailments through private yoga sessions with Asahara, with the example of him being able to sense cancer from a student through his spirit force and him guiding him towards remission. The ability to fight cancer through his energy is then cited as an example of one of the miracles that sets Asahara apart. Though all we saw was him seeing the cancer, and then they say he guides them towards a cure, nothing more about how he does so or an ending to the story. It just trusts you to believe that it would work. Is the student even still alive? I guess we'll never know. Part 8 is about Asahara and many of his pupils visiting the first palace in Tibet, where Asahara recounts that one of his past lives was as the Tibetan Dalai Lama. That's it. There really isn't anything else there besides dull shots of them climbing up the mountain to get there. In Part 9, we see a story in which the narrator is on watch for the guru during a high snowfall, and her partner in the watch falls ill, only to wake up and attempt to leave for a girl he's smitten for. Once again against the cult's rules, and very dangerous in the snowfall. Only for the guru, who is in a separate cabin, to use the emergency radio to save him from walking out to his death, somehow able to sense that they were in danger and that him walking back to the camp would kill him. Finally, in Part 10, we see a little girl on a plane with her mother, who are both members of the group. The little girl is crying out in pain due to a mysterious issue with her neck. They seek out the guru on the plane, who performs astral surgery on her neck, causing her to feel better instantly. From there, we get an epilogue where we learn that this is a very common feat of Asahara, and through the process, he often harms himself by absorbing their karma, at one point even being diagnosed with liver cancer. It then ends by calling him the savior of souls, the one who wishes to let everyone live a life where they can reincarnate properly, saving them all from damnation. Truly, he is our hero. Now, it's easy to mock this for its cheapness and its failure to really be able to tell any story properly. I mean, as you just heard, all of these quick 5 to 8 minute segments are pretty much just, he did a cool thing, we love him, and that's it. And it should be mocked. It's bad. It's flat, cheap, boringly composed with the storytelling skills of a brick. It's the reason why I've been constantly making fun of it this entire time. It's a laughable product. But there is one thing this film should be noted for more than any of its poor quality elements. It's a lie. The film paints Asahara and Shinrikyo itself as peaceful and happy, bringing light to all. A piece of pure, unadulterated, meditative bliss. But this couldn't be further from the truth. At the same time of the release of this OVA came the disappearance of one of their most ardent public critics and his family, including his infant son. At his home, they found a badge from the group. Years later, their bodies would be found. They had all been murdered. And this was only the beginning. Because in reality, they were a doomsday cult who believed that they would be the only ones to survive the apocalypse. And thus they wanted to bring it on themselves. At an Australian farm far from their headquarters at Mount Fuji, Shinrikyo had a factory building some of the most dangerous chemical and biological weapons known to man, while a nearby weapons factory built guns. All throughout the late 80s and early 90s, they were recruiting, using TV as PR.
They invited the guru into a talk show overnight. Or maybe they are not so bad then, right? They're just strange. Maybe they are safe.
This is what the Transcendental World was about. It was a recruiting tool. It was meant to grow their ranks and make them more powerful. And unfortunately, they grew large enough to commit their most terrifying attack. The one that would land the group in infamy forever. March 20, 1995, a paralyzing nerve agent known as sarin gas was released in 5 train cars in a Tokyo subway at peak rush hour morning traffic. Sarin gas was first produced as a pesticide by the Nazis and now banned throughout the world as a weapon of mass destruction. The gas manages to disrupt all bodily functions. The heart rate slows and blood pressure ceases to exist as bodily fluid fills the orifices, often leading the paralyzed and unconscious victim to die a horrible death as the fluid fills their body. There is an antidote, but it needs to be administered as soon as possible, and with the nature of this attack, it became impossible to properly administer it fast enough. All told, 14 people would eventually die due to complications from this attack, with many suffering life-altering disabilities and health conditions for the rest of their life. Those who got away from even that had to deal with PTSD and declining health due to the harmful nature of even a tiny exposure to the gas. Asahara was the ringleader, and it was him who committed the attack. 192 members were indicted for the gas attack, with it hanging over the heads of Japanese citizens in the decades since. If you've ever visited Japan, you'll know that public trash cans are hard to find, and that is because of these attacks, as many feared having open trash cans to the public would result in many using them to commit similar acts. All told, thousands of Japanese citizens were impacted directly by the attack, and millions were indirectly scarred by it. In 2018, Shoka Asahara was among 7 members of the cult executed by the state after over a decade on death row. In retaliation and protest of their execution, a man drove his car into a crowd in Harajuku, injuring 9 people in the process. So while this group has seemingly ended in its prior form, there are still clearly sympathizers out there. The amount of injuries and dead bodies related to this one organization makes it hard to view this film as anything but a malicious, disgusting piece of media. What little joy I had before mocking it turns in my stomach like bile. It angers me to my core. These people's lives were taken, and this piece of propaganda represents the goal of wanting even more. The group may be over, at least in its prior form, and the leader may have been executed. But the horror of the act they committed lives on. But this film will too live on as the infamous lie that tried to paint a cult planning destruction beyond all imaginable fears as a group of love. And that should disgust us and serve as a constant reminder of what groups like this are capable of. But it wouldn't be the only time a film like this would put a nice face on a group full of abuse. Addiction recovery is an important thing. It's not always perfect, but I've seen people in my life saved by groups like Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an important place of refuge for those suffering from addiction, one of no judgment. And it became a sanctuary for one alcoholic by the name of Charles Dederick in 1956. But from his sanctuary would extend an awful, terrible legacy. One we're still sorting through to this day. Charles Dederick was in a rough spot when he came to his first Alcoholics Anonymous in 1956, but it was there that he discovered he had the gift of the gab. He became infatuated with speaking to these audiences, and actually would go from one AA meeting to another to extend the experience. After years of being sober, Dederick would become inspired by an acid trip to become fascinated with philosophy and psychology due to his readings of Emerson's Self-Reliance while under the drug. He'd begin to go less and less to AA, but in the while would invite some of the addicts over to his house to join in on talks on the subject of addiction and these new philosophies he had become enraptured with. This became a 3 times a week tradition where Dederick would hold his own version of AA influenced by his new interests. Eventually they became joined by more members who were recovering from harder drugs like heroin, and the speeches became more and more rough around the edges. Dederick loved it. It was here that he discovered the system he'd found for the group, one where addicts were not to be treated as full-fledged adults. They were children, to be disciplined like a father might discipline his child at the time. Total control. This was Synanon, a group founded on verbal attacks, shaming, and discipline as a manner of curing addiction. And despite how horrifying its concept is to us, it was successful at gaining a following. They got their own building, where many of them lived as they got clean, and as time went on they gained notoriety for their successes at keeping people clean. But at the same time, the verbal attacks seemingly grew more harmful within. They'd accuse each other of crimes, even completely fictional ones, and intensely group bully each other until they felt destroyed enough to admit that they were a failure, thus feeling they had to get clean to improve themselves. In 1961, Charles was arrested for operating a hospital without a license. Mostly because there wasn't really any kind of drug rehab at the time that wasn't done in a hospital. This was a very new concept. Despite the intention of the arrest to stop them, Synanon actually became wildly popular thanks to it, as the group got a huge amount of news coverage as people praised them as a new step forward. Eventually, the state of California gave them, and only them, a special exemption from health licensing. Celebrities flocked to see how the group worked. Natalie Wood, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury. It was big. Once again, drug addiction as a societal issue was starting to become majorly infamous in reputation. There weren't any other services that treated addicts without hospitalization or medication. AA was strictly for alcohol at this time, and Narconon was years away. To many people, just the idea of successfully treating many for addiction was an incredible revelation. And that's why, despite the warning signs that this may get out of hand, they greenlit a movie on this group to tell the inspirational tale. The film is immediately the highest quality thing we've covered so far, as can be seen in its visually evocative opening. A simple piano theme with text on screen, but shot and angled in a way that really grabs you. You can immediately see the upgrade of the Hollywood budget from Columbia Pictures. Shadows are less artifacts of poor lighting and more purposeful framing tools. It's all so much more finely crafted than, well... The film opens on the main character of Zenki Albo and his buddy Hopper, both heroin addicts. And Zenki is having less of a good time tonight, seemingly going through painful withdrawals. Zenki tricks his friend into going on a merry-go-round so he can run off and deal with his pain on the beach alone. But he just so happens to do it next to an open house for Synanon. It's here we are introduced to Charles Dederick, played by one of the most respected character actors ever, and Edmund O'Brien, who then introduces Betty, who is actually based on the woman who in real life would marry Charles until her untimely death, and is also played by a pre-Catwoman, Eartha Kitt. The story she tells is of selling her body for drugs until she hated herself, and and how through Synanon she had found a way to love herself again. Desperate and having heard the story from the outside, Zingy checks himself in. Here we see Zingy get introduced to the group, first through being taken care of by his love interest Joni, played by Stella Stevens, fresh off The Nutty Professor, then meeting an enemy he made in prison who is now clean and non-violent named Ben, played by Chuck Connors, well known at the time for his role on the hit TV show The Rifleman. And finally he meets Charles and his right-hand man, played by Richard Conte, who most of you probably know for playing Barzini a decade later in The Godfather. They've called Zingy there to teach him the rules of the game.
First of all, you start at the bottom. We are your bosses. You do what we say.
I'll do anything.
No matter who tells you.
Look, I'm ready to take anything you dish out. I'm used to it.
Good. We'll start by shaving off that dumb-looking mustache.
What? Why my mustache?
Look, I'm starting to get angry, and you don't want that to happen. Relax. Nobody's gonna touch you. That's the first rule around here. If you stay. No physical violence. All right. Are you gonna shave off that mustache?
I don't care. Shave it off.
Send in a couple of coordinators. And that's not all. You get a nice clean haircut, too.
Now you might have noticed something about this film. It's sometimes pretty well shot. Like, it uses black and white palette to really create some interesting contrast and demonstrate some key features. And considering the director Richard Keene has his own legacy with films like Bell, Book and Candle, Paris When It Sizzles, and Drive a Crooked Road, it's not hard to see how this film can hook you in a way. Add in all the star power I just mentioned, and you might believe you're going to get something truly special here, but then you notice it. See, I mentioned this earlier, but I need to say this again. No one knew what this was going to become later. Hell, if you aren't familiar with the later Synanon scandals, you probably can see why it'd be a beloved organization. Especially at a time like the 60s when drug addiction was seen as a moral illness of America, and disciplinary fathers were held up more commonly as the standard. So it makes sense that the film will venerate it all in a way. Except, well, the group is still Synanon, so even the cleaned up Hollywood version still exhibits the cultiness, and it's hard to watch. For example, the film just takes it at face value that this method is the most perfect thing ever, and it actually plays into this power dynamic a bit uncomfortably, implying that total humiliation is the key to recovery.
But why? I mean, I don't get it. I still don't understand why.
We know. We found that out upstairs.
Nobody loves me. You came here because you don't understand.
And that's because you don't have an understanding.
And even with the film's version of Synanon being toned down from total screaming fest to a version that more resembles the People's Roast done in the same way as a therapy circle, these elements keep popping up reminding you that this power structure could very easily destroy lives.
Now what about your kid, Joni? You were married, you had a husband, you were some college boy or something. But you got bored with him, so you decided to have a baby. Then you got bored with the baby, the one you love so much. And you brought it over to your mother's house. Now Joni is free to swing a little with her new Dauphine boyfriend. But you have one great problem. Your husband doesn't make enough money to support both your habits, you and your boyfriend. So you go into business. What kind of business, Joni? Then one day, a friend of your husband's was a client of yours. Suddenly, no business, no husband. The best thing to do is to swallow a lot of pills, huh? You failed at that, too. So you go back on the streets and find yourself some new friends. What about the baby? You didn't even think about the baby. That one you love so much. You were too busy living up in Los Angeles with some dope fiend. By the time you get back here, you're so sick you don't even remember your name. And you give some wild story about how you were forced to take dope and you were attacked on the way home from school. Boy, you had a story and a half.
I never hurt that kid, though. I always took care of him.
You shoved him off onto anybody who'd take him. What happened to him, Joni? What happened to that kid when you were out walking the streets?
I don't care. He's mine. I'm his mother.
You gave birth, and after that, you didn't do a damn thing. Did you? Well, did you?
No, I didn't, okay? I didn't.
It's hard to not see this as a form of peer pressure and gaslighting mixed with verbal abuse. The idea is to overwhelm the addict with negative ideas until they admit that they failed themselves, admit that they are solely responsible for the way their life is. In a way, it's comparable to how many police will harangue suspects for confessions to the point of pure mental anguish and manipulation. But that, of course, also comes with the history of studies that say that people will admit to anything under that duress just to escape, even if it's not true. It's not hard to see why the same thing happened at Synanon. It also ignores all the other mitigating factors. A lot of things can lead to addiction, societal pressures, mental illness, poverty, depression, criminalization, and even just genetics. There's a lot more to addiction than just the personal responsibility Synanon focuses on. Hell, it can be argued that the most effective solutions to addiction come from alleviating the social punishments that cause the addiction to fester and become shameful in the first place. Instead, this approach puts all the negativity of it on the person themselves. It makes them believe they're worthless without your guidance. It's a perfect system for obedience. As the film progresses, Joni gets to see her son, but ends up keeping him over for longer than she was supposed to and gets in trouble. In her loneliness of having to give up seeing her son, she and Zenki sneak off to finally have sex in a lifeguard's tower past curfew. Some of this is handled surprisingly well for a Hays Code-era film, but sometimes...
My wife and I would like to order some breakfast. 2 filet mignons, a bottle of champagne. What? Oh, no. No heroin. We're not doing that anymore. We're taking sex instead.
Ben catches them and they end up getting in trouble again, being told not to be within 10 feet of each other. Afterwards, Zenki runs into Hopper walking by the facility, and he asks Hopper to pick him up some caps in an act of rebellion. By the way, I love Hopper's performance in this scene. I genuinely wish we got to see more of him, because the actor is killing it, to be honest.
Well. Thanks, Hopper. I'll see you soon. Hey, Hopper! Don't goof.
But Hopper ends up getting caught in the act, though, and Zenki never gets his hit. So instead, Zenki heads off to the roof to pout, where he ends up stumbling onto one of the leaders of the organization, Pete, sneaking cough syrup. And Zenki convinces him to go share these in exchange for never telling anyone about Pete's relapse. Pete, though, feeling guilty, decides to instead come clean and tell Charles everything. This leads to Ben attempting to have heart-to-heart with Zenki about this, trying to fix his ways before not having it Zenki retaliates, insinuating that Ben secretly loves Joni, and that's the only reason why he cares. As he starts punching and slapping Ben to get him to finally fight him again. Once he succeeds and gets his fight, Zenki runs away. Charles gives Ben a talking to that just feels strange.
And you committed a sin against the ideals of Synanon. Why do you think we have such a rule, stupid? Because bullies like you would smash this place to bits if we let you. You'd take over all the Synanons, and we'd end up with a house full of idiots. The biggest guy wins. Great, but what happens if somebody bigger than you comes along, huh? Then what happens? Look at you now. You're not so tough now, Buster. I know. And you were just beginning to learn to think.
And we reach an impasse in the film. From here on, Charles, Ben, and Joni all leave the house. Charles is ordered to prison just as he is in real life, as is shown in a tearful moment. Ben is forced to leave because parolees like himself are ordered by the state to leave the premises, and Joni goes out to find Zenki. Zenki and Hopper are getting loaded out in a bar that once again proves that Hopper hanging out and talking about being a weirdo, always high street guy is by far the best part of the movie.
I walk into the record store and there's nobody in there but me and his cat behind the counter, right? But he's busy. He's doing his nails or some silly thing, sprucing up. So I say to him, "Sir, could you please tell me where the Lawrence Welk albums are? I just love Welk," I tell him. And he says, "My goodness." He says, "They're over there." Now this cat figures anybody who asks for Welk is not about to steal, right? No. Every time I go out to get a new record, I pass by the hip stuff and under my coat they go, "Zenki, I had a wildest records under my coat. I had Miles, I had Ray Charles, Lady Day. I had everybody." So I go back in the booth and I turn off Welk. I pretend that I'm listening. And that's when it happened. The music started to come from under my coat and it went into my skin. No, man, I was hearing Basie through my skin. Oh, I say, "Split, man, cool it before you flip." Well, this cat pins me and I'm in there, I'm stuck. I'm jumping in time with the music And he says, yeah. I think he says, yeah. And I figured that he heard the music that was oozing out of me, so I explained to him that I was a human record player. He makes it over, you know, leans in real close. I said, what would you like to hear, baby? He says, what do you got? So I opened my coat to show him my wild selection. Wig out. He flips and he yells for the police, and I split right into the cops. The music stopped.
When Joni finds them, Zenki convinces her to come up to his room where he attempts to make her do heroin with him, but he has a bad reaction and starts yelling and clutching his stomach and desperately sniffing what he has left, which causes her to back away scared. At the same time, Ben goes to the same club Zenki had bragged about at Synanon, finds Hopper there, and makes him bring him up to see Zenki, only for them to walk in as Zenki starts reacting even more violently, and Joni runs in asking for help. And this is where the film goes full reefer madness morality play on us.
Did you shoot any? Joni, did you shoot any? He's dead.
Dead?
And then it gets weirder. See, this seems like a normal way to leave off the morality play. It ruins the whole mature melodrama thing that was admittedly a better film, but it at least makes sense. But instead, we continue, with Joni seemingly turning into a completely different character for one scene.
What do you want? Hey, I turned a trick last night. Paid my rent. Now I need some more loot to get high. You want to be number 2, Ben? Oh, I bet you're just dying for it. It's been so long. Hey, you know, $10 and we're both swinging.
But after that strange outburst, she seemingly feels guilt and runs back to the Synanon house. Ben watches on, satisfied. I think they did that to make it a redemption at the end, proving that no one is beyond saving. But that was strangely out of character for her, and doesn't match any of what we saw in those prior scenes. I honestly don't know why it was added beyond giving her one last big monologue. After all, Joni was never really cynical about any of this, nor shows any signs of it until that very moment. And because they had just killed the only character that needed redemption, she had to fill the role, I guess? This film is an oddity to me. It's filled with actors with a lot of skill, spending a lot of time working well off each other, and at times, it's very well done. But at the same time, it's also enraptured with the idea of Synanon being just as perfect as it claims, that it acts almost like a worship film. It's like a version of Rebel Without a Cause, where it's told as if it's all the kids' fault and the parents just needed to whip them into shape. Except the kids are all fully grown adults with a serious problem. In a way, it's kind of shocking how much it tries to venerate the group, how much this actually well-done piece buys into its teachings, despite the fact it harms the film. Until you see the ending. Columbia Pictures is grateful to Synanon for the opportunity to film this picture where it all began. If you ever needed proof that money and favors have always ruled Hollywood, there you go. This portrayal was most likely influenced by this agreement to use their building as a set, a fact that gets more disturbing as we find out what all this professionalism was going towards. But with this newfound Hollywood promotion and the expansion of the group going on ever since Charles Dedrick's arrest, Synanon was booming. So what did they do with it? After years of this great success, it became clear to Charles that he had an ungodly amount of control. And now a reputation as a hero. And he knew for him to maintain his success, his control, he needed to maintain that.
From the beginning, graduation was very rare. While Synanon claimed like an 80 to 100% success rate, Chuck was increasingly reluctant to declare anyone cured. And again, AA today, it's really hard to get good information on how long people stay sober. It's the same thing for all rehab, right? Rehab programs in general, super sketchy about giving you solid numbers about relapses and whatnot. And it makes sense that Chuck wouldn't want to declare anyone cured because a cured person can relapse. And that might throw the wisdom of your methods into question, right? For another thing, if people get better, really better, then they'll leave Synanon. And in Chuck's head, Synanon was already an improvement on and a replacement for mainstream society. So he doesn't want people to get out.
See, Charles Dederick felt that he had founded a new society, something better where he was in charge. So he eliminated graduation. Those who tried to get clean now found there was no way to truly end their journey. Meanwhile, Charles started buying up gas stations among various real estate properties across the country, and a multi-million-dollar giant of an advertising company to boot, while inviting in non-addicts to fund this, with all their assets being transferred to Synanon. No longer were they a drug rehab facility. They were now a new experimental society. A society built on a new type of psychotherapy, now no longer just for addicts, but for everyone. And Charles was at the top. It's here in 1974 that Charles's lawyer Dan Garrett comes in with an idea. They don't need a medical license or to have anyone graduate. If they're a religion, no one graduates from a religion. The board unanimously loves the idea and passes it through, with only one note written down by any of them questioning it. A simple 4-word phrase that haunts me. Who will be God? Everybody, when you're in a group and they start asking this, that's when you start running. And to be clear, it doesn't take a genius to figure out who would become said God. Synanon started to exert more control. They'd take the kids to be raised away from their parents. If the parents didn't agree to it, their children would be taken away as punishment anyway. And as you might expect, the kids were raised under the iron thumb of Charles Dederick, treated as if they themselves were drug addicts because their parents were. Mikhail Gillette, frontman of the band The Airborne Toxic Event, was one of these kids, and in his memoir, he stated,
"We never used the words drug addict. We would just say someone was a dope fiend. People said this with pride, and I'm pretty sure that's what we are. And if someone were to ask us whether we are white, or black, or Dutch, or Italian, I'm not really sure, but I know we're all dope fiends because that's all anyone ever talks about." The kids would get hit really hard or locked in a closet, and there was no mom or dad to tell because they lived somewhere else, and you couldn't even remember their faces.
Groups started to spiral even more and more as the manners of manipulation increased. And eventually, Charles decided that wasn't enough, and it was time to respond to criticism with violence. Synanon's Imperial Marines were a militaristic group of Synanon followers that punished any rebellion against Charles, inside the group and out. They'd go after those who split from the group, people trying to protect them, and any journalist critical of the group. With one story famously featuring Time magazine's editor-in-chief being met outside his house and told, "We are going to ruin your life." But it all came to a head with a lawyer by the name of Paul Marantz. The year is 1977, and Paul Marantz was a lawyer who started taking on cases of former members trying to sue the organization for abuse. And that pissed off Charles Dederick. It's important to note that Paul Marantz's book on the subject, Escape: My Lifelong War Against Cults, along with an article in LA Magazine by Hale L. Aaron, and an episode of Behind the Bastards I've already played a segment of, have been the main resources for this section. These sources were all so comprehensive that I didn't really need to look elsewhere, and it felt right to shout them out considering how long this section is. Also because of what's about to happen to Marantz. You see, Charles set the entire group against this one man, targeting him and his family for crossing him. He became the singular focus of their ire, and it resulted in one of the strangest assassination attempts I've ever heard of. October 11th, 1977. Marantz went to go check his mail slot on his front door, only to discover that someone had inserted a poisonous rattlesnake into it. It sunk its fangs into him. The reason he didn't hear it was because they had cut off its rattle to make sure it would get him. Paul nearly died and spent 11 days in the hospital. Meanwhile, the story spreads around the world so fast Synanon can't kill it. Walter Cronkite even calls the story bizarre even by cult standards. This event and its inherent bizarreness killed the cult for good, as Dedrick was arrested for the incident, along with several other members of the cult, and in 1980 pled no contest to conspiracy to commit murder. As part of his plea deal, he had to have no connection to Synanon anymore, and without him, the group falls apart. The IRS removes their tax-exempt status, causing them to owe $17 million, and in a few years, they declare bankruptcy. By 1991, the group formally dissolves, and in 1999, Dedrick himself dies. There is one chapter still alive in Germany, but admittedly it exists as a footnote compared to the actual terror the group had become in terms of pure power decades ago. In all aspects besides that technicality, Synanon is dead. And that makes it even more bizarre to look back on this film, this Hollywood morality play that venerates a group taken down for abuse and attempted murder, that takes all the group's claims at face value and buys into the scaremongering around drugs, just to watch as they show that those were not quirks or oddities we were seeing. They were warning signs of something nefarious. Of all the films here, this is the one that has the least direct involvement from the organization. They clearly do receive a lot of help from the organization, but the studio chose to make this, not them. And it shows plainly what happens when we jump in prematurely to cheer on a supposed hero, someone supposedly curing a real problem, only for it to turn out we were playing into the hands of a villain. This is the film's legacy now. Looking back on it, it is a competently well-made film with solid moments. It's not like it would have survived as a classic, it's far from a stunning masterwork, but as filler on Turner Classic Movies, it would work. It's got its moments, but the sins of the group cast a shadow on every scene. It's the only reason why this film has a legacy, and yet it's also why this film fails at the same time. Because as much as it is a competent film, the stain of Synanon permeates every single frame, taking all this effort to create something that we can only look back on in disgust, as it bought into lies from a vile con man. But what about when we're tricked into supporting a group without even knowing it? So most of what I've talked about so far is pretty old though. Most of these groups haven't really been at their peak for decades. It's understandable to either think these are just groups of the past, or at least think that we've kind of run into the same tricks since then. But this is a new era in a way. Along with the boom of the internet and the spread of information comes a new boom in conspiracies and spiritualism. The new age of the new age, if you will. A lot of it leaning more into pseudoscience, paranoia, and conspiracism. The age of conspirituality. Enter Ramtha's School of Enlightenment. In 1977, in suburban Washington state, a 30-year-old mother of two, Jay-Z Knight, stands in her kitchen, when suddenly she has an apparition of the 7-foot-tall, glittering warrior by the name of Ramtha, the Enlightened One. He appeared to her and said, "I am Ramtha, the Enlightened One. I have come to help you over the ditch," at least according to her. From 1979 on, Jay-Z Knight would do public channelings of Ramtha on television and for spiritual guidance, and by 1989, she would officially open her School of Enlightenment. Since then, that school has gone on to be a multi-million-dollar business. I guess in the words of a different Jay-Z, she's not a businessman, she's a business man. That was so fucking stupid, I'm so sorry. But okay, what does the school teach? Well, there are tons of courses. In fact, she has 1,025 trademarks, which feels antithetical to the idea of spirituality to me, but they aren't my classes, I guess. And most of them boil down to one basic idea: using human consciousness to create your own reality. A sort of inherent psychic nature unlocked via enlightenment. Classes often deal with understandings of the consciousness, often based on pseudoscientific philosophy that attempts to ground the spiritualism into something more concrete. Though, as we'll see, said grounding is kind of an illusion built on nothing. But a big selling point of the group is that it tries to incorporate those scientific elements. It treats itself less as a religion and more as a school, mixing the spiritual and the scientific and how that can unlock the consciousness. But you may be wondering, what does any of this have to do with the modern age of spiritualism that was spurred on by the internet? Well, around the mid-2000s, a growth in more challenging to the norm spiritualism and conspiracy culture blew up online, shaken free by the aftermath of 9/11 and the War on Terror. Around this time is when a lot of media surrounding these topics of conspiracy and spirituality started to break out from the internet to real popular culture. Loose Change, The Secret, Zeitgeist, The Rise of InfoWars, Deepak Chopra, and one little indie documentary that outperformed expectations on a major scale, What the Bleep Do We Know? Through guerrilla marketing, What the Bleep Do We Know was able to eventually get a deal with Roadside Attractions and Samuel Goldwyn Films to distribute and get themselves set up for said success. Two very real production houses fresh off the success of Super Size Me just barely a month before, and making $16 million at the box office, this was also a huge surprise success despite being a very difficult to digest subject. So, where's the connection? Well, this film was helmed almost entirely by Ramtha School of Enlightenment members. All three directors here are members, and it's said that the entirety of the production budget was provided by an independent donor from the group. And that's all without mentioning that one of the film's experts is Jay-Z Knight channeling Ramtha.
We are here to be creators. We are here to infiltrate space with ideas and mansions of thought. We are here to make something of this life.
Yeah, I forgot to mention this part, but when Jay-Z channels Ramtha, she puts on this fake accent and really weird voice. We kind of just have to get used to it, okay? What this film is, well, it's complicated. It is mostly a pseudoscience documentary exploring concepts of quantum physics involving multiple possibilities and the impact of choice and perception on our mental state, while then connecting that to the ideas surrounding spiritualism. Basically, take a scientific idea and use that to say that what we experience is all a perception and of the consciousness. It's not correct. For the record, I am no physics expert. Last physics class I took was in high school, and my degree is in film production. I had to reach out to actual people who've studied quantum physics and consult papers to debunk a lot of this. And once I was able to understand the basics of a lot of these concepts, I was able to see why this film drives so many physicists up a goddamn wall. For example, there's a segment of the film that focuses on quantum superposition. Now, quantum superposition is the idea that, until measured, a subatomic particle has the probability of being in any of multiple positions based on their energy. Now, this is not being in the same state at once, and it only applies to the subatomic level, but this film misunderstands completely, claiming that everything is thus in multiple positions at once, and as such, many possibilities in reality are all available to you to experience at any moment. It uses a complicated scientific theory applied to subatomic particles specifically and tries to expand it to the idea of reality itself. It is a major overreach of theory, using various confusing analogies combining actual scientific ideas that are only told in part and often not meant to be applied there, only to finish with its own ideas and anecdotes that are actually completely disconnected from the subject they were supposedly talking about.
Quantum physics, very succinctly speaking, is a physics of possibilities. It opens fundamentally the question of whose possibilities and who chooses from these possibilities to give us the actual event of experience. The only answer that is satisfactory, both logically and meaningfully, is the answer that consciousness is the ground of all being.
The film's setting of the infamous water experience of Masaru Emoto plays into this, with an experiment that itself has been accused of misuse of scientific theory. The premise of this experiment is that water molecules can be impacted by abstract concepts like prayer, music, speech, causing it to change structure. And its studies show these changes, producing ugly and beautiful appearances depending on the stimuli, hence being called beautiful and ugly water. The problem is no one has ever replicated it. Emoto is not a scientist, and his manner of experimentation is full of variables not accounted for in the experiment. It is flat out pseudoscience. And yet the film takes Emoto at his word, presenting it as a true example of impacting reality through abstract spirituality because it's convenient. To be honest, the film combines so many ideas and makes so many leaps that it's hard to even properly debunk because you don't even know what the claim is that you're responding to. It's 30 ideas smashed together in one giant piece of nonsense. The film even extends from the abstract of quantum mechanics and philosophical theories into psychology, with a massive misunderstanding of how peptides in the body work, claiming that we are addicted to our emotions and that our body and health physically changes based on our emotions due to cells having a form of consciousness. And while yes, our body does have physical reactions to emotions, not on the same scale that the film presents it. It's more in the sense that fear can cause you to shake than the mind shaping our entire physiology. And no, our cells do not have a consciousness either. Not to mention, while some have obsessive compulsivity that impacts their emotions, not everyone does, and to label it as an addiction to emotions is incredibly misleading. But by the time you're questioning all those claims, you're already being taken aback by this bizarre animation trying its best to be flashy as possible, even if it only serves to weird me out.
In fact, the cell is the smallest unit of consciousness in the body.
I'm hungry.
They use these visual representations of their theories to convey the film's thesis statement: mind can control matter. The idea that our perception of the world and how we interact with it on a mental level can change us physiologically and impact others. And these strange, bizarre segments designed to catch your eye use as much metaphorical language in design situations as possible to try and get you to believe it. Which brings us to something you might have noticed. See, a great deal of this documentary is told through a fictional framing device starring Academy Award-winning actress Marlee Matlin of Children of a Lesser God, who plays a photographer who struggles with anxiety, body dysmorphia,
I hate you.
and past pain regarding a relationship of hers that fell apart. However, she's able to overcome it, not through her anxiety medication, which she dumps, but by changing her reality through changing her conscious perception. As someone who deals not only with anxiety, but a lot of disorders that require me to take medication, thinking really hard is not a replacement for them. In fact, there's a certain danger in this message that can put people at risk of harming themselves by not trusting their own doctors and medication, and instead running towards pseudoscience. When it comes to the meat of the doc, it mostly tries to convince us of its theories by trying to present an air of professionalism. It's edited wildly in a manner meant to bring to mind other high-concept scientific and sci-fi properties, giving the audience a false sense of authority on the topic, yet so breezily presented that it feels like it's trying to speak on your level. Then come the featured subjects. We've already discussed them having an Oscar-winning actress play a role in the film, but the interviewees in a documentary need to show some kind of competency for trust. Some of them are real professors in their field who just happen to believe in more of these fringe kind of beliefs, though in one case, physicist David Albert claimed that he was edited out of context and was unhappy with his portrayal in the film, which is very unfortunate. But of course, not all of them have that level of credential anyway. There's Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist with no professional physics credentials, yet has written several much maligned books on the subject. Mihal Ledwith, a former Catholic priest stripped of his priesthood by the Catholic Church due to allegations of sexual abuse of minors, who as a result went on to the US where he was less infamous, to work in the New Age space instead. Jeffrey Satinover, a psychiatrist whose belief in spiritualism comes from his own belief that it can be used to cure homosexuality. Yes, really. And of course now infamous self-help guru and alleged scam artist Joseph Dispenza, who presents his medical degree as a measure of his intelligence without mentioning that it is a degree in chiropractic science. He's a chiropractor. And of course, the most obvious one, the fact one of their sources of information for this documentary on quantum physics is a 1,000-year-old warrior being channeled through a suburban Washington mother, a fact which is not questioned because once again, the film was basically made by members of her organization. And while it's not entirely specifically about the cult, it does lend itself well to recruiting for it. It is a film about accepting New Age ideas mixed with science, with Ramtha as a major feature in interviews. It is in a way a minor dose of what one of her lessons is like, but without the knowledge of who Ramtha is, nor that Jay-Z's supposedly channeling him as a spirit until the end credits. There's a realm of legitimacy presented to every bit of this here. Real science surrounded by fake, real scientists surrounded by charlatans. It's all meant to present new strange ideas with an element of sophistication that is just not earned. Hell, that probably explains a lot of this film. I found it insufferable to sit through most of it because it presents itself with mountains of jargon and confusing directives that seem designed to confuse the viewer, hopping between boring, dry diatribes and wildly out there theories, and blending them together to make them feel the same. But that's most likely all on purpose. It seems designed to confuse and overwhelm the audience and make them believe that a concept that they may have thought they understood prior is actually much more complicated than they thought, and that they should instead trust the film to do the thinking for them. It's a common technique used in a lot of other manipulative documentaries, and it's seemingly at the center of all of this. But in a way, isn't that similar to how Ramtha's School of Enlightenment presents its lessons? Pseudoscience surrounded by respected terms and individuals appeals to authority and a knowledge that you supposedly cannot comprehend, so you should listen to them. And in her biggest stage, this documentary, Jay-Z Knight gets a chance to sell herself alongside all of these doctorate-having experts, selling her own legitimacy. It's not surprising how much the organization bought into supporting this as a result. It's practically an ad for them. But the question now is, how has the organization moved forward since? Well, first thing of note is actually one of the directors left the group. Mark Vicente left the organization only to join the intimate self-help MLM and sex cult NXIVM, from which he has since also fled from. He actually was partially recruited based on Ramtha being considered a cult and told to join a more legitimate group, which also just happened to also end up being a cult, seemingly preying on him because he was already in one. Now, he hadn't joined NXIVM until years after this film was released, and as such, we're not going to explore that group here. They had nothing to do with this film. But if you want to learn more, check out Knowing Better's video on the subject. But no, that's not what you're here for. What's Ramtha been up to? Well, some interesting stuff to be sure. Since this film, Jay-Z Knight and her buddy Ramtha have gone through several major controversies. In March 2011, Ramtha went on a racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic tirade so brutally bigoted, I cannot show you or read a single word of it. All I can say is that it somehow starts with an allusion to gas chambers, and it just doesn't get any better from then on. In response, Jay-Z Knight claimed people didn't understand Ramtha's satire, and claimed he was doing a satirical character in the same vein as the Colbert Report, shaming people for not seeing the ridiculousness of those statements. So apparently I was just trolling goes back millennia. But some of you may have wondered why I brought up the specifically political wing of conspirituality earlier. How this could ever fit that extreme. And that's simple. Ramtha embraced QAnon.
QAnon is divine intelligence. It is challenging the entire world and the evil network in every country and taking them down.
She has even sold hats and t-shirts with Q branding. And big QAnon personalities have shown willingness to embrace the cult synergy. QAnon pushers In the Matrix, Shady Groove, and the QAnon musician J.T. Wild have all made appearances at the Ramtha School of Enlightenment compound.
Wow. Sounds like a rally.
Yeah, I don't know. They're just all on board with the same stuff.
Yeah, there's a non-zero chance that like a lot of these people arrive through just, basic kind of mindfulness and meditation.
Yeah.
This was barely a year before January 6th, and despite the controversial status for support, with some QAnon supporters even balking at it, it has succeeded both at raising her profile while introducing her to both the far-right audience and getting her own audience into another fringe topic that she has used to promote herself. And this is all without mentioning the wine rituals that feature dangerous amounts of alcohol, several rituals that put people in danger, including one that included several injuries, and the multitude of lawsuits laid against her. She has a history of claiming her followers that stray will have bad things happen to them karmically, manipulating them further into the fold. There are even multiple sections of her books that read like further coded anti-Semitism. All the while, Jay-Z Knight has always strived to grow via platforms, and has so far succeeded, getting decades of interviews from Merv Griffin to CNN. But nothing has legitimized her as much as this film, putting her next to supposed experts and disguising its ideology as a scientific and philosophical message, when really it was all just a recruiting ad. And it's worrying to wonder how much this film may have helped lead to this boom in conspirituality, and how much Ramtha has reaped the rewards of it all. All the while, more and more people online get ensnared in this space of conspirituality every day. Maybe this is how it's just always gone, and Ramtha just represents the more modern version. Whatever it is, it's time to change. So far, we talked about a lot of the evil that can come from getting ensnared in groups like these. The abuse, the violence, the manipulation. But there's one group of people that plays into this mess that we've yet to discuss. Those who escape and rebuild their lives. Let's talk about Buddhafield. While the exact year is iffy, the story of Jaime Gomez begins with him traveling to Hollywood from his homeland of Venezuela. His goal? Stardom. Like many though, this did not work out with him, with his one noticeable role being the 5 seconds on screen he had as an extra in Rosemary's Baby. This is it right here. But by the 1980s, he'd begun to use his charisma and acting in a different way, first starting by becoming more and more of an expert in meditation, and eventually starting Buddhafield as a commune for it, becoming a spiritual guru in the process. And with it, he grew among the lost Hollywood youth who had failed to strike it out just like him, looking for guidance, even telling them about his own journey.
Jaime told us that he came across this guru and he was spontaneously enlightened and realized that he needed to become this leader of other people to raise their consciousness and bring them to enlightenment.
He never had a master.
But it didn't matter that it was a lie. It was the hook for those who were lost. And by 1990, he had over 100 members following him, one of them being Will Allen. Will Allen was a member of the cult that was told to record and document Jaime, to create something beautiful. But by 2007, Will ended up leaving after over a decade of abuse. And now that he was out, he had a bunch of footage of his former life and his story. And he used that to create his own film, Holy Hell. Holy Hell is a 2016 independent documentary acquired by CNN that shows Will Allen's personal experiences through the Buddhafield cult and the abuse he survived while in it.
My name is Will. I always wanted to know, why am I here? What is the point? How do I live a meaningful life? I wanted to know everything.
Through interviews, we hear the same story. It wasn't supposed to go this way. I had other plans, but I was lost and I found these people and they were so happy and loving. What comes first is the community, and that's what everyone agrees on.
I really fell in love with other people first.
First, they discover this group of people that's just unique and incredible. But that community just so happens to serve one man. The man radiating confidence and charisma. A man who claimed to have the secrets of the universe. A man who was cool and spiritual.
He was contemporary. He wasn't some little old man with a gray beard sitting in a dhoti. He was wearing Speedos and Ray-Bans, and he was dancing and he was doing, contemporary music.
A beautiful man. A man who fit into the ideal of a guru. A man promising to save them, to make them feel safe and happy. And thus the group started to grow and work together and more. Tells them he can reveal them the experience of God, called the knowing, but you had to be chosen to be ready to receive. In a sense, this creates an interesting dichotomy. You have to be dedicated enough to the religion to be deemed ready to experience it, which primes you to convince yourself already that it will be all that it's made out to be. And if he doesn't trust you, he can push it away, make you feel inadequate, something the film shows really tortured some people. And it's in this process, this routine to test allegiance, that he hooks his claws into you.
One night he spoke to me alone. He had something he needed to tell me. He said that he had been up all night, fighting with God, fighting for my life. I was fated to have a terrible accident. I was supposed to die. He said I needed to follow his guidance and I would be okay.
And it's only when you are truly dedicated to him that he allows you to meet God. It becomes powerful, psychedelic, you hallucinate. Though admittedly, much of this is most likely psychosomatic in nature, a conjuring of the mind of some kind. These were extreme conditions of manipulation they were under. And then he brings you in closer. He has you serve him directly, becoming his personal servant. It makes his praise necessary. He makes you crave it, because he's shown you God, right? He's made you separate from your loved ones so you'd only have him. And when they started to get attacked by the Cult Awareness Network, they separated into their own community, claiming they'd all lose each other if they didn't join him. And in that, he makes you trust him even deeper in that respect. And he needed that trust in order to fix you. He made them have hypnotherapy sessions with them, deeply traumatic, harrowing retellings of all their darkest moments. You'd reveal all of your darkest secrets. And it was all under the idea that it was just between you and him, and would never leave that room. That was a lie, though. He secretly recorded every single one.
Whatever transpires here, between you and I, should be kept here.
Over time, it became more and more about him, worshipping him, and members became more and more confused what the group was even about anymore. And they'd be forced to conform to whatever Jaime wanted and serve him. All the while, in the background, a darkness loomed. But it's in 2006, over a decade into the communal living that they had been doing, that background darkness would finally come into the forefront. With an ex-member emailing the entire group with an expose sharing stories of abuse they had witnessed Jaime commit. And it's with the reading of this email that the members realized they all had stories that lined up with it. There are stories being told of him making women have abortions, making people pretend to have cancer so he could pretend to cure them to grow his clout. But the most disturbing of all was the most common one, with many men of the cult coming forward with the same story, sharing similar allegations of manipulation and coercive sex forced onto them in private by Jaime. And Will was one of them. This segment of the film is by far the most emotionally wrought part of the film. It's hard to listen to these men tell these stories of abuse one by one, many tearing up in the process. And I respect Will so much for telling his story in this. He gets personal. He tells us about feeling scared and alone. He describes feeling lost. He wanted to find spirituality, find answers. He found something he thought would help him and it just hurt him. Hurt so many. It's horrifying. But in sharing their stories, they found out they were not alone. They thought they were the only ones, so they kept quiet. But seemingly the same story would pop up from someone else right nearby them, most likely someone they loved. And that pissed them off. Many of the members begin to signal that they were on their way out. And that's when Jaime tries to win everyone back. He makes a disturbing video where he proudly states, "I am not apologizing." He tries to have another knowing, but ends up failing miserably as no one is as devoted anymore, and he instead made the experience entirely about his own paranoia. At this point, there's no spirituality, just desperation. In the face of all this damage control, the numbers just went down, and charges were threatened if he didn't stop. They all missed the community, but they knew they couldn't let him keep going. Finally, Will Allen leaves the group. Unfortunately, Jaime kept teaching. He built up another smaller group in Hawaii, far away from them. So in one final confrontation years later, Will flew over and confronts him on hidden camera, where he seemingly admits in coded language that he has not actually changed.
Well, are you being a good boy?
No. I don't know what that is.
Don't you think you should learn what that is?
Good and bad. Better to find out what is best.
Have you been being your best boy?
I'm just being.
The film ends with these ex-members having attempted to rebuild their lives, reconnected to those they cut off, all while hoping this one film may actually help stop him. Heroes, it wasn't Jaime that they were there for. It was the community of each other. And in one final sequence, we see clips of the many ex-members, and some still there, shown in one final short film that Will made right before leaving, with lower thirds telling us who was still there and who had left. A beautiful presentation of Will's art in spite of the conditions, and something that actually becomes truly spiritual. A tale of survival despite the man trying to tear them down for his own use. The film can be a tough watch, but it's one I felt necessary to include. The way it's able to weave all of these people's stories together into a vivid picture of desperate people finding community in this group, only for it to harm them in the long run, is absolutely fascinating. You can feel Will's passion in the making of it. The use of all this real footage presents a home movie personableness that adds so much of these emotional testimonies. And not only does it tell us the story of this group, it tells us the story of why people get into these groups in the first place. It's hard to blame them, to feel lost like so many of us have felt in our life, and to find communion in a community that provides meaning to a world that felt meaningless. It can be easy to be tempted by that and ignore the warning signs. I don't think there's a film out there as adept at understanding this as Holy Hell is. Holy Hell premiered at Sundance on January 25th, 2016. It was immediately praised for being one of the most harrowing and personal cult documentaries ever made. Jaime, for his part, had attempted to spy on the film's early screenings and create boycotts. And by the time the film premiered on CNN, he had sent a statement to them about how this film had rewritten history. He even reportedly told his followers to threaten and harass the ex-members of the film, sort of creating his own fair game doctrine. But the film worked to destroy Jaime. Don't get me wrong, he still has a now smaller group that follows him. But that isn't what I mean. What I mean is that he's finally gotten that worldwide fame he's always wanted. Now more than ever, he is known all over the world as the one thing he never wanted to be called: a cult leader. He's known as a fraudster and a monster, and he will never shake off that label. But this not even being the only piece of media focusing on him, as Netflix produced an episode profiling him as part of their series How to Become a Cult Leader that further grew his infamy. He's had the one thing he cared about more than anything destroyed: his goddamn ego. What Holy Hell shows through its intimate lens is something we've yet to explore. So far, we've talked about how cults use propaganda and manipulation, how they misrepresent facts or entrance you with their stories, how they impress upon you their importance. But from this personal perspective, we finally see what it's like to truly enter the jaws of the beast. To start off as someone lost and scared in an uncaring world, desperate for answers as so many of us are, and to find a seeming answer to it all, only realizing too late that it's all a lie.
I never thought I'm going to join a group and give my power to someone, but there is a social proof that happens, and there's groupthink that goes on. There's a wave of agreement because we're all agreeing to do it. A lot of the principles of the East versus West that we were doing, surrendering to the guru, dropping your ego, taking your shoes off before you walk into a room and leave the world behind, we didn't think of it as giving our power. We thought of it as empowering. And he also had a relationship with each one of us individually. He ended up getting everyone's power individually, one at a time.
But it also gives hope. It shows that you can leave. People left Shinrikyo. People left Synanon, and well, people left Buddhafield. Cults are made of obfuscation, and the biggest way to combat them is the light of information. It's hard. People become deeply invested once they feel there's no way out, and groups like these have a way of sinking their teeth into you. But leaving is always possible, even when it's hard.
I'd say to anyone thinking of leaving a cult that they shouldn't give up. You can find the strength to rebuild a life that you're in control of. Even when it seems like there's no hope left, it will get better. I'm so grateful I found the strength to pull myself through the worst of it, and I'm in a happy place in my life. Many didn't. Over 50 members of my old cult have committed suicide. Their deaths should be on the conscience of the cult's leaders.
Cults can seem mildly amusing from the front, even just something to point and laugh at. But there is sometimes real pain and real harm happening beneath the surface. This high-control structure that preys on those looking for something new and unique, something that enters their primal inner question. That structure that preys on the lost has claimed so much. The other films I presented were in a way representative of how groups like these recruit or present themselves. At times it became sickening the lies that were being told and how many got trapped inside. But Holy Hell represents something different, something freeing. the ability to escape groups like these, to be free. And hopefully that can honor the legacies of all the people who've been victimized by cults and keep others from getting victimized in the future. We have to end the cycle, or else more will be victimized every day.
Now, don't you want to become a cult leader? Don't you want devoted followers who leave their families for you, give their money to you, give their bodies to you, give up their lives for you, and will kill for you?
I'd like to give a special thanks to my $10 a month patrons, Arif Hassan, Kim Pine, Cameron Kanaki, Tegan B, Morgan T, and Justin Shepard.